The needle punctured skin at 2:47 in the morning. 40 seconds later, the hiss of trapped air filled the ICU bay like a trapped animal finally breathing free. Captain Megan O'Brien didn't hesitate. Didn't call for backup. Didn't wait for the residents still gathered around the monitors debating whether Corporal Stevens' trachea had actually shifted left or if they were just tired. She knew. She'd seen this exact pattern in a tent outside Kandahar with nothing but a headlamp and shaking hands and a Marine bleeding out on a stretcher meant for someone else. The fluorescent lights buzzed their eternal mechanical song above her as she moved. Blue shadows pooled beneath the ventilator, beneath the 4 stands, beneath the monitor showing oxygen saturation dropping like a stone through water. 72. 68. 63. The numbers fell with the rhythm of a countdown. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, the motion so practiced it looked almost casual to anyone watching, though no one was watching her, not really. They were all watching the patient. They never watched the nurse until something went wrong. Saturations at 58, someone said. A resident. Male voice, panic pitch. Should we call respiratory? Megan moved past him without answering. Her hands had already moved on their own, already found the second intercostal space along the midclavicular line, already located the exact spot where a pocket of air was suffocating her patient from the inside out. Needle decompression. The procedure lived in muscle memory now, written into tendons and reflexes that belonged to someone she wasn't supposed to be anymore. Someone who'd spent 18 months learning anatomy not from textbooks but from watching bodies fail in real time under conditions that had no name in medical school. The needle went in. The angle was perfect. 23 years of nursing had taught her precision. 5 years before that had taught her something deeper, the knowledge that hesitation killed people faster than any blade. The air rushed out with a hiss so loud it cut through the machines, through the ambient noise of the ICU, through the white noise hum of a hospital at night. Oxygen saturation climbed. 68. 75. 82. 88. Sinus rhythm steady on the monitor. His color returned to something approaching human. The trachea straightened itself like a bone settling back into socket. Stable. Breathing. Alive. The young resident stared at her with the expression of someone watching a stranger accomplish something that defied his understanding of the chain of command. How did you know? I mean, we were still evaluating whether. Breath sounds asymmetrical. Right side silent. Tracheal deviation. Classic tension pneumothorax. Her voice came out flat, measured, the cadence of someone reading vital signs rather than explaining a diagnosis. She was pulling the angiocath out now, moving with the efficiency of habit. 2 minutes more and his heart stops. She didn't say it was something she'd learned in a place where the difference between 2 minutes and 4 minutes was the difference between going home and being folded into a flag. She didn't say that Rodriguez had taught her this exact technique over coffee one afternoon in June, showing her on an orange he'd grabbed from the DFAC, poking his finger through the skin to demonstrate the pathway of the needle. Rodriguez, who'd become the medic who replaced her when she left. Rodriguez, whose absence now was more permanent than any transfer. The monitors hummed their mechanical validation. Heart rate stable. Oxygen saturation holding at 91%. The crisis had ended as quickly as it had arrived, the way combat did sometimes, a sudden violent darkness followed by a return to ordinary breathing. Corporal Stevens' eyes fluttered open for a moment, glassy and confused, his pupils still dilated from the sedation. His lips moved soundlessly. Then he drifted back into whatever depth the ventilator and the morphine drip had pulled him into. Megan stepped back from the bed. Her hands were steady now. The trembling, if there had been any, had already passed through her system and out into the fluorescent-lit air. She had learned a long time ago that fear was a tool, not a master. Fear kept you sharp. Fear kept you honest about the stakes. But fear couldn't run your hands. Muscle memory ran your hands. Training ran your hands. The knowledge that someone would die if you hesitated ran your hands. You need to document that, the resident said. His name tag read Dr. Hassan. He looked about 26, still shaved so close his chin gleamed, still wearing scrubs with a crease down the front like they'd just come from packaging. I mean, you did the procedure, so you need to file the report with Dr. Whitfield, since he's on service, Anne. I know the protocol, she said. She was already moving toward the sink to wash up, the medical equivalent of walking away from a conversation. Her long sleeves pulled back as she scrubbed, revealing forearms marked with faded pale lines, old rope-burn scars from field training exercises, from carrying ammunition cans by cord, from 1,000 small histories that had no place in a civilian hospital and therefore no explanation she was willing to give. The water ran hot. The antiseptic soap smelled like citrus and regret, though that was probably projection on her part. Soap didn't carry emotion. Only people did. The ICU bay behind her had already shifted gears. The crisis mode was fading. Routine was reasserting itself like water returning to level. One resident was updating the chart. Another was checking the ventilator settings. Hassan stood in place, still wearing the expression of someone who'd just watched a street magician reveal how the illusion worked and wasn't sure whether to applaud or report it to the licensing board. In the corner, the heart monitor beeped its steady electronic rhythm. Corporal Stevens slept the heavy sleep of the sedated, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical precision of the ventilator, his body finally stable in a way it hadn't been 5 minutes ago. Megan dried her hands on paper towel and moved through the double doors that led back to the main ICU corridor. The hallway was empty except for the night shift nurse staffing the station, Keisha, who was 8 months pregnant and had stopped commenting on Megan's unusual hours somewhere around month 4. The fluorescent lights cast everything in shades of blue and grey. The smell of floor wax mixed with antiseptic and something metallic that might have been old blood or just the imagination of someone who'd spent enough time around trauma to know its scent. She went to her locker in the staff break room. Row 3, left side. The space was institutional and small, barely large enough for her jacket and the spare scrubs and the personal items that accumulated over 5 years of showing up to a place that had never asked for anything more than her nursing credentials. She opened the door and reached past her jacket, the civilian one, navy blue, nothing distinctive about it, to the back corner where she kept the shadow box. The folded flag was inside, folded the military way, a triangle of red, white, and blue with the precision of origami that only happens when someone has practiced the motion thousands of times. Ceremony. Ritual. The kind of goodbye that doesn't actually say goodbye because goodbye implies you're leaving someone behind when really they were already gone before you understood what that meant. Rodriguez's flag. The medic who'd replaced her in Kandahar. The one who'd done the job she'd taught him how to do, who'd learned to read vital signs in the dark and to move with purpose and to know that hesitation was a bullet to someone you'd promised to keep alive. The blast happened 6 weeks after she left. The intel briefing said it was an IED. The memorial service said it was Rodriguez and 2 junior enlisted and a translator who'd been interpreting casualty reports back to the battalion. The silence afterward said it was her fault for leaving. She touched the flag once, her finger barely grazing the corner of the triangle, then closed the locker door. The sound it made was small and final. She still had 3 hours left on her shift. There were medications to dispense, vitals to monitor, a patient in Bay 7 who'd been extubated that morning and kept asking if the nurse's station could turn down the hallway lights because they were giving him headaches. There was work. There was always work. What there wasn't, yet, was any indication that Dr. Whitfield had learned what she'd done. That changed at 6:42 a.m. when his shoes clicked across the ICU tile floor with the precision of someone walking toward a confrontation he'd already planned and rehearsed in his mind. Italian leather, polished to a shine that probably cost more than Megan's entire week's salary. The white coat was pristine, undoubted by the actual process of patient care. His face carried the expression of a man arriving at a scene where the puzzle pieces didn't fit the narrative he'd constructed. Behind him, walking slightly slower with a folder already in his hands, was the hospital administrator, Mitchell something, a woman Megan had spoken to exactly once in 5 years, during her onboarding. Dr. Whitfield stopped at the nursing station. He didn't greet anyone. He simply looked at Megan with an expression that suggested he'd discovered her stealing narcotics rather than saving a patient's life. His eyes were the color of a shark's eye, pale gray, remorseless, moved by something that had nothing to do with kindness or curiosity. "Miss O'Brien," he said. His voice carried the particular cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "My office. Now." The conference room on the third floor of Riverside Community stretched like a courtroom, 23 doctors and nurses arranged around a mahogany table that had witnessed 1,000 small humiliations. 7 in the morning. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge. Coffee cooled in white ceramic cups. Dr. Whitfield stood at the head like a prosecutor, his pressed white coat creased sharp enough to draw blood, PowerPoint glowing behind him with the words Protocol Compliance Review in clinical blue. He'd been waiting for this moment. Megan could feel it in the way his eyes found her across the table, the deliberate setup of his stance, the folder already positioned at his elbow like a weapon laid out on cloth. He smiled. The kind of smile that meant someone had decided your day would be a very specific kind of difficult. "Miss O'Brien," he said, letting her name sit in the air like bait. "Since you're so confident in emergency interventions, perhaps you can enlighten us. What's the half-life of adenosine?" She answered without hesitation. 30 seconds. Correct. And the contraindications for calcium channel blockers in wide complex tachycardia? 2 seconds stretched between them like a held breath. She knew this, had known this for 5 years in Kandahar when she'd been something else entirely, when these drugs meant the difference between a Marine's next breath and his last. But she also knew the trap wasn't the question. The trap was the room. The eyes. The way Dr. Chen wouldn't meet her gaze. The way the younger nurses shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "Hypertension," Megan said quietly. "Cardiogenic shock. Pre-excitation syndromes. Acceptable." His smile widened, predatory. The mechanism of action for autoplays at the cellular level. This one she let sit. Not because she didn't know it, but because she understood what he was doing, not asking, but performing. Building something in front of witnesses. The silence was maybe 4 seconds. Long enough. "I see," Whitfield said, and the pleasure in his voice was unmistakable. "Perhaps we should all remember that instinct without knowledge is just guessing. Dangerous guessing. The kind that gets people hurt." He turned to face the room fully now, abandoning her entirely, which somehow made it worse. Protocols exist because brilliant people died so we could learn from their mistakes. Not because we're trying to limit nurse autonomy. Because we respect evidence. We respect hierarchy. We respect that some decisions require a medical degree, not just. He paused, letting the weight settle. Instinct. The room was a held breath. Megan's face remained absolutely flat, a mask of surgical steel. Her hands lay folded on the table, not trembling, not clenched. Just there. Cold. She let him finish his entire monologue about scope of practice and professional boundaries and knowing one's place. The word place hung in the air like a slur. When silence finally came and filled the space where his voice had been, Megan stood with the precise, unhurried movement of someone who had nowhere to be but exactly where she chose to be. She gathered her notes, the ones she'd taken on medications and contraindications she'd learned while holding a tourniquet on a screaming kid from Arkansas who'd stepped on an IED. The ones Whitfield couldn't possibly fathom because they came from somewhere his education would never reach. "Strange how you remember textbooks better than patient names, doctor," she said, and her voice dropped half an octave, the kind of tone that made ears recalibrate. "Mr. Stevens in 407. You called him Stevens 3 times yesterday." "Stevens." Like you were reading from a phone book instead of a chart. She held his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "Just textbooks, though. Good to know." She walked out while he sputtered, his face flushing the color of old meat, and the room went so quiet you could hear the ventilation system's electronic prayer humming through the walls. 2 days passed. 2 days of charts and vitals and Corporal Stevens asking her questions she couldn't answer without opening doors she'd sealed shut 5 years ago. 2 days of Dr. Whitfield's bureaucratic machinery grinding forward, incident reports filed with risk management, incident reports CC'd to the nursing board, emails forwarded to hospital administration with her personnel file highlighted in yellow like a crime scene. She'd seen them all, because the hospital operated on the beautiful assumption that transparency meant people wouldn't notice the knife before it went in. The elevator at 3:15 in the afternoon, shift change, the ding of arrival. Megan stepped in alone, pressing her floor, and Dr. Whitfield followed like a shark that had caught the scent. As the doors slid closed with that soft pneumatic whisper, his arm shot out, blocking them, opening them again. The car lurched slightly, irritated, like it resented the interruption. "I need to say something," he said, and his voice had lost its boardroom polish. This was rawer. Hungrier. "I've been at this hospital for 9 years. 9 years building my career, my reputation, my standing in this community. You're a nurse. That means you follow orders. My orders. You don't showboat, you don't second-guess physicians, and you certainly don't embarrass me." His voice cracked slightly on the word embarrass, and Megan understood then that this wasn't about protocol or scope of practice. This was about a man who'd built everything on being the smartest person in the room suddenly sharing space with someone whose competence came from a source he couldn't access, couldn't buy, couldn't earn. "You don't embarrass me in front of my colleagues. Do you understand your place?" The elevator dinged, going nowhere. Megan stared at the brushed steel wall in front of her. Her reflection was a ghost in the metal, pale, steady, erased. She counted to 5. "Your father donated $2.3 million to Emory the same year you got your residency slot," she said, her voice level as a blade. "I read the donor records. They're public." She watched his face drain white, watched the color evacuate like water from a sinking ship, watched his mouth open and close with no sound coming out. "You have no idea who you're standing next to." She stepped past him as the doors opened. He didn't follow. That night, 9:47 p.m., Megan opened her locker on the 5th floor break room. Red spray paint, the color of old blood, covered the inside, grunt nurse in letters maybe 8 inches tall, crude and violent and somehow pathetically small. She stared at it for 30 seconds, then transferred her belongings to a different locker, the one 3 down, which was empty and white and clean. She didn't report it. Reporting it meant acknowledging it, and acknowledging it meant the pain was real, meant something had landed. She sat in her car in the parking garage for an hour. 10:47 p.m. to 11:47 p.m., in the dark under the fluorescent glow of the structure lights, gripping the folded flag from Rodriguez, her teammate, her medic, her friend who'd replaced her in Kandahar and hadn't come home. The flag was the size of a paperback novel, folded into that perfect triangle they'd taught her to fold once, years ago, when she was someone who understood what country meant. Her knuckles turned bone-white gripping it, her breathing shallow, her mind somewhere over the Afghan mountains where the air tasted like copper and diesel and the screams never stopped echoing. The next morning, 11 o'clock, Corporal Stevens was improving. He'd been talking more, asking questions about his recovery, trying to sit up in bed without assistance. Megan changed his linens during the routine refresh, cool hospital corners, the soft rustle of starched cotton, the faint smell of industrial detergent that smelled like 1,000 other hospital rooms in 1,000 other cities. As she tucked the top sheet, her sleeve rode up past her wrist, and the rope-burn scars from Kandahar caught the window light. Stephen's eyes went very still. Recognition flickered across his face like a switch being thrown, the kind of recognition that only comes between people who've stood in the same terrible places. He said hesitantly, his voice still rough from the breathing tube they'd removed 2 days prior. Were you deployed?" Megan's hands didn't pause. She finished the corner, pulled the blanket smooth, and said, "You need rest." That needle decompression, Stevens pressed on, and there was something in his voice, not desperation, but the sound of someone recognizing their own country in a stranger's hands. "I've only seen that speed in combat. I've only seen hands move like that one place. Who trained you?" She changed the subject. "Vitals. Cardiac panel. Did he need anything for pain?" The professional compartmentalization of a woman who'd learned long ago that acknowledging who she used to be meant opening all the doors she'd worked 5 years to lock. But the truth was already starting to move in the walls. The machinery that would eventually demolish everything had begun its quiet grinding. By day 6, Corporal Stevens' breathing had become a whisper of what it should have been. His oxygen saturation dropped like a stone, 94% at morning rounds, 89% by lunch, the downward trajectory spelling something Megan recognized before the monitors caught up. She watched his chest rise and fall with increasing effort, the work of breathing climbing with each shallow cycle. His right side moved less than his left. The asymmetry was subtle enough that a careless observer would miss it, but Megan had held dying men in desert heat and learned to read the body's language when it was begging for help. At 1:15 p.m. she paged the resident, a third-year named Chen, who moved with the careful hesitation of someone still building confidence. She explained what she was seeing, the oxygen saturation trend, the chest wall mechanics, the distant breath sounds on the right side that shouldn't be distant. Chen ordered a portable chest X-ray and told her to monitor closely. The films came back at 1:47 p.m. showing minimal infiltrate, no obvious pneumothorax, nothing that would explain why Stevens was slowly suffocating in a hospital bed surrounded by people trained to prevent exactly this. Megan studied the radiograph on the computer screen, her eyes moving across the familiar anatomy. The previous film from 6 hours earlier showed nothing. This new one showed almost nothing. But the clinical picture told a different story, one the machines hadn't caught up to yet. She tracked down Dr. Whitfield at 1:53 p.m. near the nurse's station, his presence creating a subtle shift in the air pressure around him, the way authority sometimes did when it was built on hierarchy rather than earned respect. His expression shifted when he saw her approaching, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth like he'd been expecting this moment. She kept her voice level, professional, without a tremor of the certainty she felt. "Dr. Stevens is developing another pneumothorax. The trachea is starting to deviate. We need a chest tube now." Whitfield glanced at the most recent X-ray, then back at her, his eyes holding that particular brightness of someone about to enjoy themselves. "The film is clear, Miss O'Brien. You're catastrophizing. Maintain current orders." She tried again at 3 p.m. when the tracheal deviation became visible to anyone who looked at Stevens' neck. The skin was beginning to show that subtle shift, the windpipe pulled toward the side where air was accumulating and pressure was building. She found Whitfield on rounds with 6 residents in tow, all of them following him like pilot fish around a larger predator. She waited for a break in his lecture about something unrelated, then stepped forward. "Doctor, his trachea is shifted. This is emergent." Whitfield didn't even look away from the resident he was addressing. When he finally turned to her, his voice carried the kind of cold clarity that made it impossible to argue without sounding hysterical. "I said maintain current orders. Are you questioning my clinical judgment again, Miss O'Brien?" The residents watched. The silence stretched like a blade being drawn. Megan's jaw tightened, a barely visible clench in the muscles, but her voice remained flat. "No, sir." She nodded once and walked away while Whitfield returned to his lecture without pause, the small victory playing across his face for anyone who cared to see it. The shift change came at 8 p.m. Megan found the night nurse, a competent woman named Patricia who'd been at Riverside for 4 years and knew how to listen without judgment. She pulled Patricia into Stevens' room and kept her voice low, clinical, stripped of emotion. "Watch him every 15 minutes. Asymmetric chest wall movement, diminishing breath sounds on the right, oxygen saturation declining despite supplemental oxygen. He's compensating but barely. If his SAT drops below 85 or his work of breathing increases, page me immediately. Don't wait for Whitfield." Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly, the expression of someone who'd learned to read between medical lines. "How bad?" Megan didn't answer with words. She simply looked at Stevens, then back at Patricia, then back to Stevens. The message was clear. Patricia nodded. Megan drove home to her small apartment in East Atlanta, a one-bedroom that could have belonged to anyone, no photographs on the walls, no personal effects beyond the basics, nothing that would suggest a life before this. She opened her laptop at the kitchen table and began searching. Nursing positions in Denver, Seattle, Portland. Cities where no one knew her name, where a resume with Riverside Community's reference would be impossible, where she could vanish again into the kind of anonymity that had kept her sane for 5 years. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed nothing. The screen stared back at her, waiting. She stared back. Her phone buzzed at 9:47 p.m. A text from her sister in Jacksonville. "Where did you go?" Mom's asking. "Please just call me back." The message sat there in the glow of the phone screen like an accusation. Megan read it twice, then deleted it without responding. The same sister she hadn't spoken to since driving away from the Naval Hospital 5 years ago, the same voice that had left voicemail after voicemail asking what happened, asking why she wasn't at the funeral, asking if she was alive. Megan had answered none of those questions because answering them would require explaining, and explaining would require reliving, and reliving would break something that had taken 5 years to rebuild into barely functional form. She pulled out Rodriguez's flag from the bottom drawer where she kept it beneath a stack of scrubs. The fabric was faded now, the red stripes barely pink, the blue field gone almost grey from being held and unfolded and refolded in parking lots and bathrooms and the driver's seat of a parked car at 2 a.m. when sleep was impossible. The flag was small, the kind presented to the family of a fallen service member, and it had been given to her by Rodriguez's mother at a memorial service that Megan had attended as a ghost, someone in the crowd who didn't belong but couldn't stay away. Rodriguez's mother had pressed it into her hands without a word, and Megan had carried it ever since, hidden in the way you hide evidence of a life you're trying to forget. She ran her fingers across the fabric now, tracing the folds that had worn thin from repeated handling. Outside, rain began hammering against the apartment windows, the sound like artillery in the distance, the same rhythm that had played overhead during monsoon season in Kandahar. Her hands remained steady. But the trembling wasn't in her body. It was deeper than that, in a part of her that still remembered what it felt like to have a purpose, to have been someone, to have mattered in a way that made sense. At 10:33 p.m. her phone rang. Patricia's voice came through tight and controlled. "Steven Sat is 81. He's struggling. I need you to talk me through what to do." Megan was already standing, already moving toward her keys, already shifting from the woman staring at the flag to something else entirely. Her voice when she spoke was different, not louder, but deeper, carved from bone and certainty. "I'm 15 minutes away. If his SAT drops below 75, call a code and start bagging him. Don't wait for a physician. Is that understood?" Patricia didn't hesitate. "Understood, Captain." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that in those 15 minutes of driving through rain-soaked Atlanta streets, Megan understood that she was about to save a life in a way that would burn everything down, and she was going to do it anyway because that was who she was, no matter how many names she wore or how many cities she tried to disappear into. Some things you couldn't outrun. Some truths you carried in your hands whether you wanted them or not. The phone rang at 2:11 a.m. Patricia's voice cracked through the darkness. "Megan, he's crashing. Steven's SATS just dropped to 72, he's gasping, we're calling a code." The words landed like shrapnel. Muscle memory took over before her mind caught up. Megan was already moving, scrubs on, car keys in hand, the Atlanta streets empty and gleaming with late-night rain as she drove through red lights that meant nothing now. Her hands gripped the steering wheel the way they used to grip a rifle stock. Her jaw clenched the way it clenched in Kandahar when the mortars started falling. Some things you never forgot. Some things lived in your hands whether you wanted them to or not. She arrived at Riverside at 2:28 a.m. The badge she'd clipped to her scrubs an hour ago was the only permission she had. The only permission she needed. Steven's room was chaos, beeping monitors, the resident frozen mid-sentence, a nurse bagging him with shaking hands. And there it was again. The trachea deviated hard left. The jugular veins distended like blue ropes. His lips blue. His eyes wide. Identical to 5 days ago. Identical to the nightmare that wouldn't stop repeating. "He's not oxygenating," the resident was saying. I think we need to intubate, but the chest. Megan didn't wait for him to finish. Didn't wait for orders. Didn't wait for permission. She moved to the crash cart and her hands found the 14-gauge needle kit the way a pianist finds middle C, automatic, precise, inevitable. The kit tore open. Her fingers palpated the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The anatomy was the same. The procedure was the same. The urgency was the same. The needle punctured. The hiss of pressurized air escaping. That sound. She would hear that sound forever. The beautiful hiss of a life being saved. Stevens gasped, a real breath, oxygen flooding lungs that had been starving. The saturation monitor climbed. 75, 82, 88, 94. His color returned. His breathing steadied. His eyes moved from panic to presence in 10 seconds flat. How did you, the resident started. Megan was already charting. Needle decompression at 2:31 a.m. Left tension pneumothorax relieved. Vitals stabilizing. She didn't look at the resident. Didn't explain. Didn't mention Kandahar or the 100 times she'd done this in a FOB trauma tent while rounds landed outside. She just documented. Just worked. Just saved a life like it was nothing. Dr. Whitfield arrived at 2:51 a.m. She heard his footsteps in the hallway before she saw him. Deliberate. Measured. The footsteps of a man who'd already decided the outcome. He wasn't carrying a stethoscope. He was carrying a manila folder. Thick. Prepared. Already prepared. He hadn't come to evaluate Stevens. He'd come with a war already planned. By 7 a.m., she was in the conference room. Whitfield on one side of the table. HR director on the other. Nursing supervisor in the corner taking notes. The folder open in front of them like a contract signed in blood. Whitfield's voice was smooth, almost apologetic. Almost sad. The voice of a man performing regret for an audience. Incident report, he said, sliding papers across the table. Documenting an authorized invasive procedure. Needle decompression without physician order. Violation of Policy 7.3.2 regarding scope of practice. Another page. Another slide. Formal complaint filed with the State Nursing Board this morning. 30 minutes ago, actually. Pattern of insubordination across 6 documented incidents. Here. Here. And here. His finger tapped each one like a prosecutor building a case. Pattern suggesting a nurse who consistently disregards chain of command. Who believes she knows better than the physicians. Who, he paused. For effect. For the silence to work. Who endangered a patient by performing a procedure she wasn't trained for. Wasn't trained for. The words hung in the air like poison gas. As if Kandahar didn't exist. As if 5 years of training her hands to save lives in combat didn't count. As if a captain in the United States Marine Corps was just a nurse who didn't know her place. We've also reviewed your personnel file, Whitfield continued. His smile was the smile of a man who'd finally won something. Multiple write-ups. Complaints from Dr. Chen about insubordination. An incident in the supply room where you supposedly told a resident, he read from the file. I think you should step back and let someone who knows what they're doing handle this. Those are your words, Miss O'Brien. The HR director slid the termination paperwork across the table. 3 pages. Efficient. Practiced. Like they'd done this 100 times before to people who actually deserved it. Effective immediately, Whitfield said, your employment is terminated. Riverside Community Hospital cannot tolerate nurses who exceed their training or endanger patients. We have a responsibility to our institution. To patient safety. To maintain proper hierarchy in medical decision-making. His voice dropped into the register of genuine sadness, the voice of a man who wished things could be different. I'm sorry it came to this. But you left us no choice. Megan sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded on the table. Her breathing was steady. Her face was blank as a combat helmet. She didn't mention Kandahar. Didn't mention the 3 tours. Didn't mention the Medal of the Navy Cross hanging in a shadow box in her apartment, wrapped in tissue paper, classified and quiet. Didn't mention the 100 times she'd performed needle decompression while rounds fell like rain. Didn't mention that she'd taught junior corpsmen this exact procedure. Didn't mention any of it. She signed the termination form. Her signature was careful. Precise. The signature of a woman who'd signed casualty reports and equipment transfers and field discharge paperwork in languages Whitfield would never know. She removed her hospital badge and placed it on the table. The plastic clattered against the wood. She stood up. "I understand," she said. 8 words. That was all she gave him. 8 words and a flat stare that made his smile falter for just a second before he covered it with another sip of coffee. She walked out of the conference room. Down the hallway. Past the nurses' station where people pretended not to watch. Past the emergency department where Stevens was sleeping in the trauma bay, breathing steadily, alive because of her hands, alive and evidence that she was right and Whitfield was a coward hiding behind bureaucracy. She didn't say goodbye. Didn't explain. Didn't look back. That night at 3 a.m., Megan sat alone in the majestic diner on Ponce de Leon. The coffee was cold in front of her. The cup had been full an hour ago. Now it was just a dark mirror. She stared at her reflection in the window, the glass so dark it was almost opaque, just her face floating in nothing, a ghost wearing scrubs. Not a Marine captain. Not a decorated officer. Not the woman who'd held a position alone for 9 hours while coordinating 12 medevac helicopters under sustained fire. Just a woman who'd saved a life twice and lost everything for the second time. The diner hummed with fluorescent silence. Outside, Atlanta traffic whispered past like a river she couldn't cross. The waitress refilled her cup without asking. Didn't speak. Sometimes kindness was silent. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded flag from Rodriguez's ceremony. 5 years old now. The fabric was soft from handling, worn from the time she'd held it at 3 a.m. when the screaming wouldn't stop. Rodriguez's flag. Her flag. The only thing that mattered anymore and the only thing worth nothing at all. That was when the diner door opened. Cold air rushed in. And Marcus, her 16-year-old Marcus, breathless and soaked from rain, his school backpack hanging off one shoulder, his eyes red from crying or running or both, stood in the doorway holding a shadow box. Inside it, even from across the diner, she could see the glint of medals. Silver. Bronze. The Purple Heart ribbons. Her medals. The one she'd hidden from him. The one she'd never told him about. "Mom," he said, gasping for breath like he'd run the entire way across Atlanta in the rain. "Come with me. Right now." They're at the hospital. All of them. Everything changed in the space between heartbeats. The conference room door closed behind her with the soft finality of a coffin lid. Dr. Whitfield sat across the table with his hands folded, the termination folder centered in front of him like a place setting at a funeral dinner. HR sat to his left, pen poised, expression neutral as a surgical mask. Megan knew what this was before he opened his mouth. She'd seen it coming since Corporal Stevens' oxygen saturation climbed back into the 90s at 3:47 a.m., since her hands had moved on their own, needle finding the second intercostal space, the rush of air escaping confirming what every monitor should have told Whitfield hours before. "Captain O'Brien," he began, his voice modulating into that particular register of false regret, the tone of a man performing compassion he didn't feel. "You understand why we're here?" She didn't answer. Silence was its own form of authority. He continued anyway, his fingers drumming the folder's edge. "Protocols exist for a reason. They protect patients. They protect the hospital. They protect you." He leaned back, crossing his arms, the body language of a man who'd already written the ending. Your actions this morning constituted a clear violation of scope of practice. You performed a procedure without physician authorization. That's not nursing. That's insubordination. The morning light through the window caught the silver thread running through his hair, the grooming of a man who believed appearance was the same as competence. Megan had watched 5-year-olds with more sense of justice than this man possessed. She'd held dying soldiers while they whispered mothers' names into her chest. She'd coordinated medevac for 12 wounded in a place where the sky turned orange with incoming fire. And this man thought protocols mattered more than pulse. The board has reviewed the incident, HR said, sliding the document across the table. We're terminating your employment effective immediately. Your final paycheck will be mailed. Your hospital badge needs to be surrendered before you leave the building. There was no negotiation in her voice. There was finality. Megan picked up the termination letter, her eye scanning past the legal language: unauthorized medical intervention, breach of chain of command, insubordination consistent with pattern of behavior, all of it constructed with the precision of a man who'd spent weeks building this moment, brick by brick, each false accusation mortared with his administrative authority. He'd falsified the timeline, she realized. The incident report said she'd acted at 2:15 a.m. She decompressed Stephen's chest at 2:47 a.m. 6 minutes of margin, enough for a competent physician to have noticed the clinical signs himself. Whitfield had rewritten history to make her look reckless instead of revealing what he'd failed to see. She signed the document without comment. Her hands were steady. Her face gave nothing away. The composure of someone who'd practiced hiding behind a uniform for 12 years, who understood that in moments like this, silence was a weapon sharper than anything she could say. Your insurance benefits end at midnight, HR continued, though Megan had stopped listening. If you have questions about COBRA continuation, I'm clear. 10 words maximum. Never more. Never emotional. Megan stood, and both of them stood reflexively, suddenly uncomfortable in the presence of someone who didn't perform the expected desperation, the expected tears, the expected apology for saving a life. She removed her hospital badge from around her neck, the laminated photo showing her in scrubs, smiling slightly, the image of a woman who still believed the work mattered, and placed it on the table between them. The door closed behind her a second time, and the fluorescent lights of the hallway buzzed their mechanical rhythm, indifferent to the death of a career. She walked past the nurses' station without looking at anyone, past the trauma bays where she'd spent 5 years pulling people back from the edge, past the supply closets and the staff bathroom and the back entrance where the Atlanta heat hit her face like a physical force. 87 degrees at 10 a.m., humidity so thick it felt like drowning with the sun. She sat in her car for 3 minutes with the engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the position her father had taught her 30 years ago when she was 16 and thought she'd never need anything other than a driver's license and a dream. That night, she sat in a 24-hour diner on Ponce de Leon, the kind of place that existed in the margins of the city, neon sign bleeding pink into the darkness, plastic booths upholstered with the patina of 1,000 lonely people. The coffee had gone cold in her hands. She stared at the dark window, at the reflection that looked back, 42 years old, silver threading her temples like battle scars you could actually see, eyes that had learned to show nothing, and somewhere inside that reflection, Captain Megan O'Brien was disappearing a second time. The first time had been in Kandahar, when she'd stepped off the medevac bird and told the debriefing officer she wasn't going back, that whatever happened next, she was finished with that life. She'd driven south in a rental car, paid cash for a studio apartment in East Atlanta, and bought white shoes and scrubs and a stethoscope, becoming someone new. Someone invisible. Someone who could help people without being thanked for it. Now even that was gone. She was packing her locker the next morning, removing the small personal things that 5 years of civilian nursing life had accumulated: a photograph of Marcus at 14, a thank you card from a patient's family, a 3x5 card with the prayer that Chaplain Hayes had given her on her last day in Kandahar, when voices echoed from the hallway. Multiple voices. Getting closer. She didn't look up. People had been avoiding her all morning, the hospital staff moving around her like water around a stone, embarrassed or frightened or both. The footsteps stopped. She heard breathing. Mom. Marcus stood in the doorway, breathless from the bus ride across Atlanta, his 16-year-old frame already showing the broad shoulders of his father, his face showing the sharp intelligence of his mother. And in his hands, held like the most fragile thing in the world, was the shadow box. The one she'd stored in the back of her closet for 5 years. The one that contained the silver star, the bronze star, and the 2 purple hearts, each medal catching the overhead light like a small star refusing to dim. They need to see these, Marcus said, his voice cracking the way teenage boys' voices do when emotion cracks through composure. You can't just let him win. She looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw something break inside herself, a crack in the foundation she'd spent 5 years building. Not fear. Not desperation. But recognition. The understanding that some things can't stay hidden, that some truths demand to be told, that there was a difference between choosing invisibility and being forced into it. Come on, she said, and her voice had changed. Quieter. Deeper. The voice of someone who'd stopped running. The hospital lobby filled over the next hour like a slow tide. Corporal Stevens arrived in a wheelchair, oxygen tubing under his nose, his wife pushing him, and when someone handed her a piece of paper, she read it with the careful precision of someone who'd prepared these words the way you prepare a eulogy. That's Captain Megan O'Brien, she said, her voice carrying through the atrium. The legend from Kandahar who talked my husband through his first combat casualty over the radio. The woman who saved his life. Twice. The Marine chaplain appeared next, in dress uniform, carrying a leather folder. He walked directly to Megan and extended his hand, and when he spoke, his voice had that particular resonance of someone trained to deliver truths that matter. Captain O'Brien. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. Unit citations for Valor under fire. Coordinated medevac for 12 wounded personnel in a single 8-hour period. That's a record. Then a rear admiral, actually a rear admiral, 2 stars on his shoulder, dressed blue so crisp they could cut, walked through the hospital doors as if he owned them. He stood beside Megan and began to speak, and his voice carried the weight of institutional authority finally aligned with actual truth. Captain O'Brien saved Corporal Stevens' life using emergency needle decompression at 2:47 a.m. The same procedure she performed in Kandahar. The same skills that earned her the Navy Cross. The lobby had gone completely quiet. Even the monitors seemed to stop beeping. Then a man in a plain suit, dark eyes, the kind of stillness that comes from a government badge, quietly mentioned to someone from the hospital board that Captain O'Brien's work in Kandahar included operations still classified. Her call sign was Archangel. The entire room shifted. Every eye in the atrium moved to Megan at exactly the same moment. She stood in the center of them, her son beside her holding the shadow box, and for the first time in 5 years, she didn't look away. That evening, Dr. Whitfield sat in the WSB-TV Channel 2 studio, across from anchor Monica Pearson, his tie perfectly knotted, his posture radiating the confidence of a man about to rehabilitate his narrative. This is a case of a troubled veteran playing hero, he said, leaning forward with the carefully calibrated sincerity of someone who'd practiced this in his car for 40 minutes. I understand her service. I respect it. But civilian hospitals require protocols, not battlefield instincts. Miss O'Brien repeatedly endangered patients with reckless. His phone buzzed. Then the station manager's phone. Then the entire news desk lit up with incoming calls. The show's producer held up one finger to Whitfield. The anchor's earpiece crackled. And then the station manager nodded, and the producer made a motion to the technical booth, and a call patched through live, Public Affairs Office of the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the voice amplified through the studio speakers so that 2.3 million Atlanta area viewers heard every word. This is Colonel Hayes, USMC Public Affairs. The voice was calm. Measured. The voice of a man who understood the power of institutional authority when deployed with precision. Dr. Whitfield just slandered one of the Marine Corps' most decorated combat medics. Captain O'Brien saved a Marine's life using the exact emergency decompression procedure that earned her the Navy Cross in 2011. Perhaps Dr. Whitfield can explain why he fired her for performing the skills that the United States military awarded her our second highest combat decoration for. The studio went dead silent. You could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Whitfield's face drained of color, then flooded with it, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. The anchor cut to commercial, and by the time they returned, his chair was empty. By next morning, the hospital board had launched an investigation. They discovered Whitfield had falsified portions of Megan's termination file, changed dates, fabricated witness statements, altered the incident timeline to make her actions look reckless instead of life-saving. Medical staff came forward. Nurses testified he'd ignored their warnings. Residents admitted he'd blocked her access to the patient because he was too proud to admit she'd seen something he'd missed. Within a week, the board stripped his privileges, terminated his contract, and referred him to the state medical board for ethics violations. His Ivy League connections couldn't save him. His father's donated millions meant nothing when the truth was broadcast on national news. His wife filed for divorce. His children stopped taking his calls. And 6 months later, on a hot afternoon on Buford Highway, Dr. Whitfield sat at a folding table under a pop-up tent, wearing a cheap polo shirt with an insurance company logo, handing out flyers to people who mostly walked past. His Porsche was gone. His house was in foreclosure. His name had become a punchline on nursing forums and military Twitter. Meanwhile, Megan stood in her new office, Director, Riverside Veterans Trauma Center, a dedicated wing that didn't exist before her story went viral. Marcus was pre-med now, volunteering shifts in the ER. Corporal Stevens came monthly to teach residents the emergency decompression technique that had saved his life. And on her wall, between her framed medals and her nursing director certificate, hung Rodriguez's folded flag, no longer hidden, no longer a symbol of what she'd lost, but of what she'd carried home and finally learned to set down. If you made it this far, you already know that institutional arrogance cannot survive the light of truth. The real question is this: what will it take for your workplace to finally see you? What's your story? Tell us in the comments. Subscribe for the next segment, where the reckoning continues. And share this with someone who's been underestimated, because visibility is the most powerful weapon we have.